Brian Contos, welcome back
Robby,
to the podcast.
It's great to be back on the podcast again.
It's a three-peat. You have the most podcasts with me now.
Really? Do I get a special jacket, like with sequins?
Yeah, it's on the way. As soon as I send it.
Awesome.
So I was sitting on the bus the other day on one morning, and I was scrolling through my LinkedIn as one does on the bus, and it was like Brian Contos was thanking Mandiant for his time there and is moving on to a new adventure.
That's right. Well, it was a great ride. It was almost 6 years, which in Silicon Valley that's probably 3 or 4 lifetimes. But of course, it started with Veridin, and we had a great ride. We were acquired by Mandiant, and then Mandiant lasted a few more years, and then we were acquired by Google. And I said, well, that's great. Nothing against Google, awesome company, but I really wanted to go build something new again. So decided to jump in the saddle once again.
Yeah, cool. So I was checking out your new website, or new, I don't know if it is, but Phosphorus IoT, Security of Things. And that was new for me. I hear a lot of terms and good marketing things, but that was new. Why don't you explain that one?
Yeah, Phosphorus, it's hot. It's the the match tip, if you will. Most people know it from that perspective, and it was really funny because the notion behind it was IT security or IoT security today is kind of like IT security was in the early 90s. And some of your listeners might have been doing security back in the early 90s, but it wasn't very good. Bad passwords, patching really wasn't where we wanted it to be, even close. We didn't really have our hands around our devices. If we were lucky, maybe we had a spreadsheet or something where we tried to track all the critical network gear and things like that. But it was poor. Quite frankly, it sucked. And things started to heat up around that and started to mature, and firewalls became more common, and endpoint security, vulnerability scanners, and fast forward to today, IoT is kind of in that spot now. And what we saw is there's roughly about 3 to 5 IoT devices per employee per organization. So a 10,000 person organization will probably have roughly between 30 to 50,000 IoT devices. And most people are like, whoa, that's a lot more than I thought. In fact, when we go into companies, when they guess, I think I have 5,000 or 20,000 or whatever the number is that they throw out. They're usually off by at least 40 to 60%. So the industry was heating up. IoT is becoming this hot thing. It's $1 trillion business now, globally, IoT with all the different components. And it's being used in virtually every single industry. So it's the new hot thing, if you will. Hence phosphorus.
So it's phosphorus. Nice. So I mean, if they're off by such a large percentage, I'm assuming that's because they don't really know what an IoT, or we don't have the same definition for what IoT is, I guess. So why don't you start off with what exactly you mean by IoT?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So again, the term IoT is one that is thrown around pretty liberally, but what it usually constitutes is, one, a device that you can't put an agent on. So it's not a laptop or a workstation, so you can't have endpoint security controls on there, right? It's connected in some way, usually over wired or wireless Ethernet. Sometimes there's other forms of connectivity in addition to that. You could think of something like a KVM switch. You could think of a UPS system, a computer rack. These are things. These are devices that are connected. HVAC controllers for heating and ventilation, elevator control systems. These are all essentially, in most cases, they're Linux. Sometimes they're Android or maybe something else here and there, but primarily Linux and Android. They're little servers. They're little servers that are running all the same systems and services and protocols that you would expect to see on a traditional server, except they commonly have the default passwords, the old firmware, and things of that nature. So they're everywhere. And we see a lot of, printers are a good example. Video security cameras are a great example. Pretty common door locks that are digital door locks, physical access security systems. These are all enterprise IoT devices. And then when you go over to the SCADA world, the industrial control system world with OT, you're talking about things that control pressure and flow and temperature and humidity and all of these variables. Those are the OT devices. So Internet of Industrial IoT. And then there's Internet of Battlefield IoT, where it relates to military equipment. There's a whole breadth of these things. But again, our focus, and probably the focus of this conversation, is mostly what is discovered in the enterprise. What are these tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of devices in the enterprise?
Are any of those specific devices like more? Do they present a larger attack surface than others, or are they all sort of like, yeah?
Yeah, they absolutely do. And just to kind of give a little bit of background on that, so since about 2017, the founders of this company, uh, they had actually previously started a couple other companies like Endgame and Bastille, and where they were really focused on discovering vulnerabilities and penetration and things of that nature. So early on, they really started looking into millions and millions of these devices in production environments. And what they're finding across the board is most organizations have had a known IoT security breach. I think about 67% said, yes, we know it. We don't have great stats on the folks that don't know it, but it's probably safe to say that it's higher than 67% have had an IoT breach. And that's because the bad guys know that, one, they're out there. There's a lot of IoT devices out there, like I said, about 3 to 5 per employee. In addition to that, these devices are usually extremely insecure. And it's a great way to use them as a backdoor. And we're seeing people exploit these devices for all the traditional IT reasons, right? So cryptojacking. So I want to use all these IoT devices to mine cryptocurrency. I want to add these devices to a botnet and then use that botnet to do a DDoS attack. And in fact, we saw the Mirai botnet, which started in 2016, took down Twitter and Reddit and PayPal and a lot of Sony and some very, very big companies. And it was primarily based on security cameras that were breached. We're seeing people attack these devices and using them as jumping off points to attack other devices, IT devices within the organization, to exfiltrate sensitive data, to send out malware, to push ransomware. So all the same stuff that we're seeing on the IT side of the house, we're seeing on the IoT side of the house as well. And IT security teams, they're trying to get their hands around this, and the IT group is trying to figure out what they've got. But the sad point is, again, this goes back to my statement earlier about IoT being like IT in the early 1990s. Only about 20% of the companies that we've come across have the ability to kind of show you an inventory of most of their IoT devices. None of them say all, but about 20% said, I think we kind of have an idea of where most of them are, but they're still not very good at it. And this is something your listeners can do, which is pretty interesting. If you go to Showdown, Showdown's a search engine, of course, that you can use to find internet accessible devices, IT or IoT. But type in a word like camera or voice over IP or printer or UPS, like an uninterrupted power supply, these backup power supplies. A lot of these devices are accessible directly from the internet. You wouldn't expect that. Why would you want your UPS system accessible for the internet when somebody can just go ahead and reboot it? So that's kind of shocking. And then we're seeing the nation states get involved in this as well. So Russia, of course, is top of mind for the world right now. There was a tool called Fronton, Fronton, and was specifically designed to be an IoT hacking tool. It was designed by contractors for the Russian FSB. Well, it got stolen from the Russian FSB by a hacking group called Digital Revolution, who actually released the code for Fronton to the world, so you can download it from torrents and all the usual places your audience might find their hacking tools. So there's that side of it. So we know governments are investing a lot of time and resources into this as well. And there's even some IoT devices that ship directly from the manufacturer with malware already installed that are already known for doing malicious things. And here in the U.S., we actually, this was a bill that was passed. U.S. federal agencies and contractors of U.S. federal agencies aren't allowed to use certain brands of IoT devices, specifically some that are made in China, because they have some phone home capabilities. And cameras, for example, can be used to record things and send audio and video back, and all sorts of malicious things like that. But I want to get back to your question. I didn't forget your question that you had a minute ago, which is I just thought it was important to lay some groundwork there. But some of the things that we see as maybe the worst offenders, and that's a great question because almost everybody has these. The first one, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but KVM switches, right? And I think most of your audience does a KVM switch. Basically, I've got a rack, I've got a whole bunch of servers in there, and I've got this switch. And the switch allows me to have remote video connection, mouse connection, and keyboard connection, one switch into all these devices, right? So I have, it's a one-to-many type relationship. But what we're finding with these KVM switches, and I won't call out any brands, but we came across one that was running Ubuntu Linux version 10. To give you a feel for that, Ubuntu Linux version 10 came out in 2010. It's now like version 21 point something or other. It had hundreds of vulnerabilities on it because it's old. You would expect it to have these vulnerabilities. And it doesn't matter what kind of endpoint security you have or application security or identity security or whatever it is that's on those servers. If this KVM switch is vulnerable, it's jacked in to all these other devices, giving an attacker easy access. So that's one of the big offenders. Another big offender, and this is another group that people don't necessarily pay a lot of attention to, are what's called lights out management controls. Now, this is, think of a server, and you've got your Ethernet connections in the back, and you have this other Ethernet connection. Well, that Ethernet connection is a lights out management solution. And all it is a little Linux server that's installed. And a bunch of folks make them, HP, Dell, Super Micro. You might have heard terms like ILO or iDRAC or IPMI. These are just basically different versions of these lights out management tools. A little bit like KVM, but it allows somebody to do system administration on these machines remotely so they can access all these disparate systems. The problem is, most folks don't bother to change the default credentials on these guys, so you can just do a quick little Google search and find out, hey, what's the default username and password on this? Again, they're not upgraded. They're usually running Linux or VxWorks. So again, they're little Linux servers. They're running old firmware, vulnerable, and there's even malware specifically designed to target these. So KVM and Lights Out are two examples of stuff that people might not necessarily think about in terms of, here's a computer device that I need to take a look at. Another one are server cabinets and racks. Again, there's just this big rack here. There's this cabinet with all these servers in. A lot of these things have UPS systems, cable management, tamper sensors, all these things. Again, they can be hacked into. You can shut down the power. You can reboot these machines. You can cause them to overheat by shutting down the cooling, etc. So those are the ones that are a little, I like to call them systems that manage systems, right? And they're kind of core to most organizations. They're very, very common. You'd be hard to find a Fortune 500, Global 2000 government agency that doesn't just have a ton of these. When I say a ton, I mean, we've seen organizations that literally have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of these types of devices. But now we kind of turn the page a little bit. And another group of big offenders, and this one's pretty scary, are physical access control systems. Again, they're little Linux servers and they're controlling biometrics to doors or key card scanners and all these things. We were working with one financial services company, and we were able to determine that on this device, it was a Linux IoT device that hadn't been upgraded. It had 3 critical CVEs, which was great. We could have used those to potentially compromise it. But we said we don't need to do that because we just looked up what the default password was, and that's what it was using. So it was very simple. There was no hacker skills involved. And we were actually able to unlock and lock over 6,000 doors throughout all their various buildings. And this was a big financial services company. And that's pretty scary, right? To think that, somebody could just open up all the doors using a password that they just Googled. And another one, everyone's got these, are printers, right? So I think it was Black Hat 2019. I think it was Black Hat 2019. They released some studies and they had found critical level vulnerabilities. And of course, vulnerabilities on the CVSS scale are 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, 10 are called critical, which means you don't have to be on the local network. You can take over the device. It's the most grievous of attacks. But critical level vulnerabilities were discovered on over 10,000 printer brands, types, and versions. And that's because there's a lot of white labeling going on, a lot of sharing of libraries in the IoT community. So the vulnerability on this camera also shows up on this voice over IP phone or this or that. But the thing about printers is they're super promiscuous. In the world of IoT, they're the most promiscuous because they want to be easy to use. Plug me in and I'm going to talk all the protocols, all the services. Please connect to me, connect to me, connect to me, right? So they've got wired and wireless and Bluetooth and all these different protocols and way to communicate with them. And that's great. You want them to be uber useful. But what we also find is they're hardly ever updated. They're always vulnerable. And here's the kicker on printers. Most enterprise level printers have about a 20 gig hard drive. You know, it's not huge, it's not small. Well, we've actually seen attackers upload hacking tools, to these devices. They'll use those to scan the rest of the environment for traditional IT devices, databases, Active Directory systems, et cetera, et cetera. And then they'll steal that data, compress it, and exfiltrate it out like over ICMP or something of that nature. And the bad guys love hacking printers because they're everywhere and everybody's got them and they're a juicy target. But I would say the number one out of all of those things are security cameras. By far the worst offender. Now they're usually running Linux. There's a version of Linux called BusyBox, which is pretty common. But the thing about some of these security cameras, the number one camera on Amazon until very recently, if you bought it, it was a consumer grade camera, but used in some enterprises, came with malware pre-installed. You didn't even have to worry about getting infected. They skipped the middleman. You just take out of the package, it's already compromised. And that means somebody could, turn this camera off. They could view your stream. They could view your audio. There's all sorts of problems related with that. Also, organizations have thousands or tens of thousands of these cameras. And is it facilities that manages it? Is it IT security that manages it? Is it somebody else? There's a lot of finger pointing in terms of saying, well, who's actually going to take responsibility to, one, give us a list of what we've got. Two, make sure the firmware is not end-of-life or vulnerable. And three, make sure that the credentials are being rotated frequently, every 90 days. They're complex passwords, special characters. All these things are at least 15. All the traditional stuff we'd want in IT apply to that, and it's just not happening. And again, I mentioned this earlier, but some of these manufacturers of these security cameras are actually banned for use in U.S. government agencies because they are so insecure. So there's a lot of buzz around these types of devices, but those are some of the big ones. Those are some of the big offenders.
There's a lot. I have a million questions, but my first one is if when you get a router at home and you type in the IP address, or some of them have an IP address, some of them actually have a website you go to, and then you just change it. Is it that easy, or is it more complicated than that?
Yeah. So that's certainly an IoT device, right? And this is sort of sad, actually. What we've found is across these IoT devices, 50% of the time you don't need to hack anything because their credentials are default. It's the default username and it's the default password. And 100% of the time on the enterprise side of things, the password was changed, but it was only changed once. And it's usually, to be quite honest, it's usually a very bad password because they go, oh, well, God, I got a million of these things. I mean, think about it. If you don't have a way to centrally manage these devices, and you've got 1,000 cameras, are you going to bother to put on a really complex password on each one of these things? No, normally it's something very basic. So because historically there was no way to kind of centrally manage that, the passwords are awful. So 50% of the time they're default. The other 50% of the time they've only been changed once, and that thing might be sitting there for 10 years. It was probably set to a bad password to begin with. A great example is
company name in the year, right?
yeah, or even the device name, right, or something, or the company's name. And to your point earlier about your home internet router, yeah, a lot of cases it's logging into a little web interface on that device. Sometimes you connect over SSH, or even clear text protocols like Telnet are extremely common. These are general ways we connect to IT devices the same way we connect to IoT. There's no difference. And again, and I'll stress this, these are usually Linux or Android systems. And they have all those capabilities, so we connect to them the same way. So that's really scary, the fact that you can find these devices and they're filled with vulnerabilities, but in most cases you don't have to worry about hacking anything. You can just use a default password. Yeah.
You said something earlier. It's interesting that changing passwords, like a password manager for IoT. Uh, is that a part of your product, for example? Is that something that's like normal?
Good question. So there's lots of what are called PAM, privileged access management tools, and we integrate with all of them. But the issue is PAMs can't communicate with these IoT devices because IoT device communication, there's just so many different flavors, and if you do it the wrong way, you can knock it over. You can actually take it off the network, which you don't want to do, right? So what we do, which is really cool, is during the discovery phase, we call it interrogation. So basically you scan your network, kind of like a vulnerability scanner, but you're not looking for vulnerabilities. You're just doing discovery. And one, you say, okay, I found these devices. Here's 1,000 devices. And during that process, you can actually automatically enroll those devices in Thycotic or HashiCorp or CyberArk, whatever your PAM tool is. So now it's in there. So now you've actually enrolled those devices with the PAM, which is cool. And you can say, look, we're going to rotate the password every 90 days. It's going to be a complex password. And Phosphorus is smart enough to say, hey guys, that's cool. We're going to do this. But this device over here, it still only takes a 4-digit numeric PIN. And this device here, you can't use a hyphen. And this thing here, you can't use the letter B. We've seen all sorts of craziness in IoT. So based on the level of password capability that device allows, we automatically create special groups within the PAM tool. And there's a lot of cool science behind how all this is done. But we create these groups to say, hey, for this guy, 4-digit PIN. For this guy, complex characters, but only up to 10. This guy can go up to 20 characters, but can't have a hyphen. So all those things are created. Now, 90 days approaches. It's time to rotate. The PAM can't talk again to the IoT tool. What it will do is it will go ahead and talk to Phosphorus. Phosphorus will make the change, and then via API, update that information to PAM. So Phosphorus becomes like the middleman, if you will, for that process. And it's a really clean way of making sure all those devices stay kind of in sync. So that's kind of half of that puzzle, right? I've discovered my devices that I want to remediate. If I can deal with credentials, that's kind of one half of what I want to address. The other half is the firmware. And this will kind of blow your hair back too. About 26% of the devices we come across, the firmware is end of life. It's not just old, it's completely end of life. And if I told you that on your IT network, you jump off this call right now and you could fix those devices. That's a huge issue. But the remainder, that 74%, the average age of the firmware is 6 years. Could you imagine operating your iPhone?
Yeah.
It just wouldn't work. So it's absolutely nuts. So we quickly said, look, we want to help people discover it, for sure. We want to help them manage credentials. Okay, that's another big piece. But now we actually want to help them manage the firmware. But with the click of a button, you can say, I want you to update all of the firmware on all of my cameras, or schedule it for midnight on Saturday, or whatever process that you want to do. I'm going to do 50% now, 50% later. But this is the cool thing. Just like we talked about with the credentials, where you can say, hey, you're a 4-digit PIN, but you can take a complex password with special characters, upper, lower case. On the firmware, we need to know, hey, you're on version 3, but version 6 is out. Can you go right from 3 to 6? Or do you need to go 3, 4, then 5, then 6? And it just depends on the IoT device. So we have that notion. So that's all done very quickly and easily for the customer. Again, they just click on the button, they select it, upgrades the firmware. But here's the kicker on firmware. Sometimes you actually want to downgrade firmware on IoT. And a great example is Log4j. Log4j was all the rage in the news not too long ago. Let's say I'm on version 5 of my firmware on my printer, and it has a Log4j vulnerability. And the vendor knows. They said, guys, look, this has this vulnerability. We're going to have a patch for this, but unfortunately, it's not going to be ready for another 4 weeks. We have to do testing. But version 4 of that printer firmware doesn't have that. So you might make a business decision that says, look, we're going to go ahead and downgrade the firmware. It has some vulnerabilities, it has some issues, but at least it doesn't have this Log4j problem that everybody and their brother is attacking right now. So I can actually downgrade if I want to, and then later on upgrade when the vendor comes out with a new version that doesn't have that vulnerability. And that's really cool, because if you think back to your home internet router, when you're trying to upgrade your firmware, you got to Google the firmware. Where is it? Okay, what version do I have? Let me look up the serial number. Okay, do I have the right one? Now, what do I do? Do I have to stick a paper clip in it? Do I hold this button down? It's a pain. Now you multiply that by, hundreds of different types of IoT devices, and in collection, maybe you have tens of thousands or 100,000s of IoT devices of those types throughout your organization. It would take you a millennium to get all those things updated, which is why they haven't been done historically. So just by allowing organizations the ability to discover their IoT devices, manage their credentials with PAM integration, right? And then do the firmware management. That's huge. That's huge. That addresses not all of the security issues. There's several other things we do, but that's like a big piece. And if you can do that, man, you're leaps and bounds ahead of pretty much everybody else that's out there.
Is that because are you able to do? You mentioned earlier about like having a 4-digit code or not being able to be or something like that, right? Is that because you've seen so many IoT devices and you have a relationship with these IoT vendors that these like sort of like, okay, you can't go from version 4 to 7 without, you have to go through 4, 5, 6, and 7? How do you know all these things?
Yeah, so we actually have these devices in our laboratory,
okay.
so we're customers. But let me preface that there's tens and tens of thousands of different types of IoT devices for the enterprise. But we break it down into what's called, probably the easiest way is to think back to biology, right? It's a genus species model. So we talked about printers. Let's take HP printers. HP's been making printers for what, 30 years? A long time, probably 30 years. Across HP printers, there's tens of thousands. They've made tens of thousands of physically different kinds of printers. Okay, we're not going to have a lab with tens of thousands of printers. That would not be a good business model. So we do a genus species where HP is the genus, and under that there's firmware species. And what we found with HP, for example, and this analogy maps to all the vendors, security cameras and everybody in between, when they have a large wealth of devices, is that HP is the genus, but the species are the different firmware families. And what we discovered is about every decade, HP releases about 3 different firmware families, so 3 different species. So by us being able to integrate and understand the operational capabilities of those species underneath that genus, we're able to understand the capabilities, the password strength and the firmware upgrade capabilities and things like that. So it's actually highly scalable. So to put that in terms of how much code we have to write, in order for us to support an HP printer, we have a set of code. Now a new firmware species came out with that. That's just a couple lines of code. That's not hundreds of lines of code. So it's a highly scalable, extensible capability. And that was one of the things that had to be developed early on, because this is not like IT where you have a relatively finite number of operating systems and routers and switches, general IT equipment. IoT can pretty much be anything, and any new device can be added. There's gunshot detectors and elevator controllers, and there's so many interesting things that you can't have everything in a lab. So we have this very scalable model. So our lab is filled with hundreds and hundreds of cool IoT devices, and even IoT robotic dogs, which are kind of cool and really, really interesting things. But we'll probably never need to get to the point where we have, multiple thousands of devices. It'll be a rich lab, but it won't be anything that will, be more than a traditional office could handle. We don't need a city block warehouse, for example, in order to pull.
Yeah, well, it sounds like a very smart way of doing it, if you ask me.
Well, it's the only way we could. It's the only way to survive. But you know what? One of the interesting things, Robby, when we started looking at this and we were pulling them all together, is we said, well, let's just look at this from a pure vulnerability perspective. And again, if we look at CVSS scores, go from 1 to 10, 10 is the most grievous, the most critical. 1 is not really a critical issue at all. About 50%, again, across the board, had a CVSS score of an 8. Another 18% had a 9 or a 10. So 68% of all the devices, almost 70%, right? Almost 70% of these devices have 8, 9, or 10 level vulnerabilities. And some of that goes back to whitelisting and the sharing that we talk, or not whitelisting, white labeling, the sharing of code and libraries. Also a big problem is a lot of folks that generate IoT devices, they're not tech companies. They're not software development companies. They might be an agricultural firm, and they need to take this thing and somehow put it online and make it connected so it can communicate the content of soil or moisture or whatever it is that they want to monitor. So they hire a couple engineers, and as cheaply and as quickly as they can, we want to get this thing online. And I guarantee you, when cheap and quick is the scenario, security doesn't come into that. So great, we got this thing online, we can push it out to our customers, they can monitor it, everything's wonderful. The problem is, that's when you land in a case where you've got 70% of these devices have critical or high-level vulnerabilities that you're trying to address. So it becomes pretty problematic, and we see a lot of that in this space. And the bad guys love it. Again, the cyber criminals and the nation-state hackers, a lot of them are going after IoT, because why bang your head against the firewall and the endpoint security and the app security? You can just kind of wrap around that back door, get into that lights out management, that KVM, that rack, whatever it is, and now I've got the keys to the kingdom.
Interesting. Well, it makes total sense why you hopped into this company when you did. I laughed when I saw Anton Chuvakin, the Google guy. He commented on your post and said, "Oh, so you think IoT is important now?"
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those. It's just one of those things where the time has come, right? The time has come.
Yeah, yeah. And I've had an episode of the company called Microshare, and they were like facility management IoT. And I also had this other IoT company that specializes in medical IoT. There's a bunch of different like little ecosystems within the IoT world, I guess. But it seems like I mean you're covered like a bunch of areas that they never mentioned. But is there like small environments in there? Or?
It is. It's a really good point. So just like IoT, there's so many different types. In IoT security, there's a lot of ways to tackle this problem. And there's some companies that tried to approach this by just taking all your IoT stuff and saying, look, guys, it's really vulnerable, so we're going to kind of push it over on this VLAN. We're not going to fix it. We're just going to kind of stick it over here and hope that things will be okay. So there's some VLANing companies. There are some other groups that actually take the device and dissect it, and they've got probes and oscilloscopes, and they're checking the chips and pulling apart the firmware and reverse engineering. That's really cool too. That's a little bit of a different approach. That's really kind of trying to help the vendors out to build better devices. And then there's some other things in between. But we really saw a need for just everyday organizations that say, look, we got a bunch of stuff. We don't know where it is. It's insecure. Can you help us find it? Can you help us fix it? And that was just a gap that wasn't being filled. So now the IT security team can manage IoT just like they managed IT. It fits into this equation nicely, and it kind of takes them to the next level. So that's kind of the value proposition of this at the end of the day.
So you will be able to use traditional IT security tools if you have something in the middle, for example, Phosphorus, that sort of puts them in a position to be,
Yeah. Like we don't want to become a SIM. We want to take all the logs that we get and send it to your Splunk, for example, your ticketing system, your SOAR systems, things like that. We want to integrate with all of this stuff. We just want to make sure IoT, again, if you have 3 to 5 IoT devices per employee in your environment, chances are you have a lot of vulnerable backdoors into your organization that will be, if they haven't already been compromised, and could be, exfiltrating data out, could be spying on you, could be causing all sorts of horrendous problems, and probably are already being used to leapfrog to your traditional IT devices. So, let's pull these things together. Let's get in front of this problem.
I was just thinking to myself, I wonder how mnemonic every once a month or once every 2 months at least has like this lessons learned from incident response, right? And I have yet to see like an IoT device be the cause or be the way in. But I'm gonna go out on a limb and say it's only because that company that got breached, they just didn't have logs from anything, so they have no idea where it came in or how it got there anyway.
They're so blind to it, which is sad. And so here's a great example: the Mirai botnet, which was started in 2016, was successful because systems were running Telnet with default passwords, and again, they used those cameras and other devices that had those same vulnerabilities, which were some voice over IP phones from printers, things like that, to take out Sony, Twitter, PayPal, Reddit, GitHub, things like that. So pretty big tech companies. That was back in 2016. There are devices today, right, in 2022, that are still vulnerable to Mirai because they haven't been updated since those vulnerabilities came out. And what's even worse is there's devices that are still running the malware from Mirai, the command and control capabilities, because they've never been fixed because the organizations aren't watching them, and there's this video camera up here in this bank, or these thousands of video cameras that I'm not paying attention to. We had one customer that didn't know that they were breached on their IoT devices until they were getting their power bill, and their devices were being used to mine crypto. So it's a crypto jacking attack. And because of that, their power bill got really, really high. And they're like, what's going on? But I think the most grievous actually are using, certainly there's a lot of malicious things you can do with IoT that cause impact to the physical world. Unlocking doors, shutting down power, turning security cameras on on the company that installed them. There's that. And then you can add those IoT devices to botnets and do DDoS attacks and spread ransomware. That's all horrible stuff, of course. But what we're seeing now is people using the entry point of an IoT to get into other critical systems and then do data exfiltration or get into other critical systems where ransomware can be installed and approach it in this way. So it's prudence dictates that if you have all of these devices, there's so many vulnerabilities, so many default passwords, so many ways in, that they're going to be used as a lever by attackers, whether it be cyber criminals or nation states, to exploit these organizations. It's not a question of if, it's happening right now. And as I said before, 67% of the organizations we've worked with have had a known IoT breach. I would say that number is much, much closer to probably 90% if we had better statistics from the folks that weren't able to track these types of things. Investment's growing as well. So these organizations, again, primarily Fortune 500, Global 2000, government agencies, 93% of them are spending more on IoT security today than they were last year or the year before that. It's something that's increasing substantially. And it's also something that you might have thought would have gone down a little bit during COVID and the pandemic and people were working from home more and things like that. It was absolutely the opposite. In fact, we saw an increase of attacks on IoT devices during that time period. And now that people are going back into the office, and certainly I live in Silicon Valley, like Apple and Google and Facebook, all the employees are coming back in now. I don't think that's going to change. So it's the new attack surface. It's the new. The bad guys already know it. The good guys were starting to figure it out, which is great.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you came to a great place. Sounds like an awesome company. The only thing that makes me kind of sad is that you're going to be there for a while now, and I'm not going to have any new topics to learn. I'll be able to talk to you about for a while. I guess you can come back with some war stories.
Yeah, hopefully we can connect when I'm out there again in Europe. And again, we're growing very quickly. This is a global company, and our footprint's expanding. So I can't wait to kind of share some more stories of what we're seeing in the field, the stories from the trenches, if you will. 6 months from now, as we gain even more cool stories.
Security of things. Phosphorus. Wow. Nice. Mr. Contos, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Robby. It's great as always. Yep. Bye-bye.